Zeitoun woke to screams and curses. He had somehow managed to doze off in the early hours while draped over the steel rack. He stood and saw that down the line of cages more prisoners were being sprayed. Now the guards were shooting the pepper spray through the fencing. They didn't bother removing the prisoners from their cages. The tactic lessened the individual dosages, but spread the gas all over the complex. After Zeitoun and Essar prayed, they and the rest of the prisoners spent the morning shielding their eyes and mouths with their shirts, coughing through the poison. The splinter in Zeitoun's foot was now infected. It was darkened to a dull blue overnight, and he could no longer put any weight on it. He had seen his workers, most of whom were uninsured and afraid to register at a hospital, ignore their injuries. Broken fingers were unset, horrible cuts were untreated, and led to all manners of sickness. Zeitoun had no idea what kind of object was lodged inside him, but knew he needed to take it out as soon as possible. All he needed was a moment of attention, a sterile needle, a knife even, anything to carve into the foot and remove whatever was lodged inside. The pain was intense, and Zeitoun's cage mates tried to help to come up with a solution, anything sharp to use on it, but none of them had even a set of keys. Minutes later, a man emerged from the station and came toward him. He was wearing green hospital scrubs and had a stethoscope around his neck. He was portly, with a kind face and a duck-like walk. The relief Zeitoun felt in the second he saw him approach was beyond measure. "Doctor?" Zeitoun asked. The man did not break stride. "I am not a doctor," he said, and continued on. Breakfast again was MREs, an omelet filled with bacon, and again Zeitoun and Essar gave their pork to Todd and Ronnie. But there was something new to the breakfast this day, Tabasco, and Zeitoun had an idea. He took the small bottle and slammed it into the cement, breaking it into shards and blades. He took the sharpest piece and cut into the swollen area of his foot, releasing far more fluid, clearer than white, than red, than he thought possible. Then he cut through the dark object lodged inside, and after soaking his foot in blood, he pried it out. It was a metal sliver the size of a toothpick. He wrapped his foot in the extra paper napkin in the cage, and the relief was immediate. Throughout the day, there were more pepper sprayings, both individual treatments and more indiscriminate ones. In the late afternoon, one of the guards brought out a thick-barreled gun and shot it into one of the cages. Zeitoun thought a man had been killed until he saw that the gun was shooting not bullets, but beanbags. The victim writhed on the ground, holding his stomach. From then on, the beanbag gun became a favorite weapon for submission. The guards alternated between the pepper spray and the beanbag gun, shooting the men and women in the cages. Jerry continued to engage Zeitoun and Essar in conversations. He was pointedly uninterested in Todd and Ronnie. He asked Zeitoun more about his heritage, about Syria, about his career, about his visits back home. He churned through the same line of questioning with Essar, always disguising it with good cheer and innocent curiosity. Essar reticent by nature, withdrew almost completely. Zeitoun tried to brush off the questions, feigning exhaustion. The presence of Jerry grew more unsettling by the day. Who was he? Why, when there were almost 100 prisoners elsewhere in the complex, was he in their cage? Todd would later insist that he had been a spy, a plant, meant to glean information from the Syrians in this cage. Of course, he was undercover, Todd said. But if this were true, Zeitoun thought, it was a very dedicated public servant. He ate outside in the cages, and when night fell and the air cooled, he slept as Zeitoun's cage mates slept, without blankets or pillows, on the filthy ground. That night, when it was his turn to lie over the guardrail in the cage, Zeitoun tried to do so comfortably, but could not. There was a new pain in his side, coming from the area of his right kidney. The pain was sharp when he tried to drape himself over the steel rail, and when he stood in place it dulled but remained. It was yet another thing to think about, another reason he would not find rest this night. At midday, Zeitoun and the cage mates were told they would be moving out of Camp Greyhound. A series of school buses pulled into the far area of the lot. Zeitoun was removed from his cage, handcuffed, and pushed towards one of the buses. He was lined up and then handcuffed to another prisoner, a man in his 60s. It was a simple school bus, decades old. Zeitoun and his companion were told to board. They shuffled up the steps, past the armed driver and a handful of armed guards, and sat down. Todd, Essar, and Ronnie, all paired with new men, were brought onto the bus. None of the 50 prisoners aboard were told where they were going. Zeitoun looked for Jerry, but he was no longer with them. He was gone. They drove out of the city, heading north. Zeitoun and his man, to whom he was handcuffed, did not talk. Few prisoners spoke. Some seemed to know where the bus was heading. Others could not imagine what was next. Still others seemed content that finally they were out of the bus station, that it could not possibly get worse. They left the city, and Zeitoun saw the first expanse of dry land he had witnessed since the storm. It reminded him of a reaching port after a long trip at sea. The temptation was to leap from the ship and dance and run on the solid and limitless earth. 40 miles on, Zeitoun saw a sign on the highway indicating that they were approaching the town of St. Gabriel. He took this as a positive sign, or darkly comic one. In Islam, the archangel Gabriel, the same Gabriel who in the Bible spoke to the Virgin Mary, foretold the birth of Jesus, is believed to be the messenger who revealed the Quran to the prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, Gabriel is described as having 600 wings and is assumed to have accompanied Muhammad when he ascended to the heavens. The bus slowed at what at first looked like a country club. There was a vast green lawn enclosed by a white fence, the kind typically surrounding a horse ranch. The bus turned and passed through a gate of red brick. On the entrance, Zeitoun saw a sign confirming where they were, the Alien Hunt Correctional Center. It was a maximum security prison. Most of the men on the bus seemed unsurprised. The silence was absolute. They made their way down a long driveway lined with tidy trees. White birds scattered as they approached another gate. This one resembled a highway toll booth. A guard waved the bus through, and soon they arrived within the prison grounds. Hunt Correctional Center was a complex of one-story red brick building laid out across an immaculate green campus. Everything was arranged in orderly grids. The fences and the barbed wire atop them gleamed in the sun. The grass was brightly and newly cut. Sprinkles ticked and spun in the distance. The prisoners were processed one by one at tables placed outside. Zeitoun's entrance interview was brief, and his hosts were polite. Two women asked him about his health, any medications he was using, his food restrictions. He was struck by how professional and respectful they were. It occurred to him that this level of professionalism might mean the standard procedure, a phone call for the accused. Would be observed, and he would be free within a day or two. At the very least, Kathy would know he was alive. That was all that mattered. They were brought into a changing room and told to strip naked. Zeitoun did so, in the company of a dozen other men, and with such numbers he did not fear strip searches or violence. He removed his shirt, shorts, and underwear, and they were taken away by prison workers. He and the other prisoners were given orange short-sleeved jumpsuits. They were not given underwear. Zeitoun stepped into the jumpsuit, zipped it up, and put his shoes back on. They were put back on a bus and driven through the prison complex, an array of geometrically arranged buildings and blue roofs. The bus stopped at what seemed to be the last prison block, in what was evidently the highest security section of the prison. Zeitoun and the others on the bus were led into one of the long cell blocks. He was brought down a long concrete hallway and then directed into a cell. It was no more than 6 feet by 8 feet, meant for one prisoner. Nassar was inside already. The door closed. The bars were baby blue. The cell was constructed entirely from cement. The toilet was molded from cement and placed in the center of the cell. The bed on the side of the room was made of cement with rubber mattress atop it. On the back wall there was a small window covered in thick plexiglass. A vague white square was visible, presumably the sky. Zeitoun and Nassar barely spoke. There was nothing to say. They both knew their predicament had just taken a far more serious turn. The two Syrian Americans had been isolated. When they had been caged with Todd and Ronnie, it seemed possible that the charges against them, whenever they were actually leveled, might be limited to looting. But now the two Syrians had been separated from the Americans, and there was no predicting where this would go. Zeitoun remained certain that the one phone call would free him. He was a successful and well-known man. His name was known all over the city of New Orleans. He only needed to reach Kathy, and she would knock down every wall to get to him. All day Zeitoun made it his business to sit by the bars, waving a napkin, pleading with the guards to grant him a call. The guards seemed to relish concocting variations of their denials. Phone's broken, they would say. Not today. Lines are down. Maybe tomorrow. What do you do for me? Not my problem. You're not our prisoner. This was the first, but not the last time Zeitoun would hear this. He had not processed in a traditional way and was not assigned to hunt for the long term. Therefore, he was not technically a hunt prisoner, and so was not bound by the institution's standard operating procedures. This is what Zeitoun was told many times by the guards. "You are FEMA's problem." FEMA was footing the bill for his incarceration. They said that, and that of all the other prisoners from New Orleans, the Alien Hunt Correctional Center was renting space to warehouse these men, but otherwise made no claims to the welfare or rights. The night came, but was barely distinguishable from the day. The lights were out by 10, but the prisoners was full of voices. Prisoners talked, laughed, screamed. There were various unidentifiable sounds coming from all corners, smacking, grunting. The smoke seemed to increase, and the night went on. The smells were rancid: cigarettes, marijuana, old food, sweat, decay. The pain in Zeitoun's side had gotten worse. It was throbbing ache, as if his kidneys were inflamed. He never overworried about any such problems, but if Kathy had been right, that toxins in New Orleans had found their way into his body, or perhaps it was the pepper spray at Greyhound, he had surely inhaled enough of the gas to cause some internal reaction. But he dismissed the pain. He could think only of Kathy. It had now been 4 days since she had heard from him. He could not imagine her suffering. Where would his mind be if she went missing for 4 days? He hoped she had not told the children. He hoped she had not told anyone. He hoped she had not found comfort in God. God had a plan, he was certain. In the early hours, Zeitoun, weakened by lack of sleep and food, and the grim nothingness of his surroundings, recalled the passage of the Quran called Al-Taqra, or the Darkening. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, when the sun is darkening, when the stars plunge down, when the mountains have been set in motion, when the pregnant camels have been ignored, when the savage beasts have been assembled together, when the seas have been caused to overflow, when the souls have been mated, when the buried infant girl has been asked for what impiety she was slain, when the scrolls have been unfolded, when the heaven have been stripped off, when hellfire has been caused to burn fiercely, when the garden has been brought to close, every soul shall know it was it prone. So no, I swear an oath by the stars that recede, by the ones that run the settling stars, by the night when it swarms, by the morning when it sighs, truly that is the saying of a generous messenger, possessed of strength, secure with the possessor of the throne, one who is obeyed and trustworthy. Your companion is not one who is possessed. Saturday, September 10th. Again, Zeitoun had not slept. The night before, the fluorescent lights above had been turned off at 10 p.m. and had come on at 3 in the morning. In this prison, 3 o'clock was considered the beginning of the day. After he and Nassar prayed, Zeitoun tried to exercise inside the cell. His foot was still raw, but he jogged in place. He did push-ups, jumping jacks. The pain in his side, though, only increased with the activity. He stopped. Breakfast was sausage, which he could not eat, and scrambled eggs, which were nearly inedible. He took a few bites and drank the juice provided. He and Nassar sat on the bed, side by side, barely talking. The only thing on Zeitoun's mind was making a phone call. There was nothing else in the world. He heard the guard coming down the hallway, picking up the breakfast trays. As soon as the footsteps were close enough, Zeitoun leapt up from the front gate. The guard jumped back a step, startled by Zeitoun's sudden appearance. "Please," he said, "one phone call." The guard ignored the question and instead looked around Zeitoun to Nassar, who was still sitting on the bed. The guard gave Zeitoun a quizzical eye and moved on to the next cell. An hour later, Zeitoun heard the guard's footsteps again, and again Zeitoun rose to meet him as he passed the gate. "Please, can I make a call?" he said. "Just to my wife." This time the guard issued a courteous shake of the head before peering around Zeitoun to see Nassar, who again was sitting on the bed. Now the look the guard gave Zeitoun was suggestive, even lewd. He raised his eyebrows and nodded over to Nassar. He was implying that Zeitoun and Nassar were romantically engaged, and that Zeitoun, fearing detection, had leapt from the bed when he heard the guard approaching. By the time Zeitoun realized what the guard was implying, it was too late to argue. The guard was gone down the hall, but this implication that Zeitoun was bisexual, that he would betray his wife, so enraged him that he could barely contain himself. At midday, Zeitoun was taken out of his cell. He was brought to a small office where a prison guard stood next to a digital camera. He instructed Zeitoun to sit down on a plastic chair. As Zeitoun waited for the next command, the photographer squinted at him and cocked his head. "You eyeballing me?" he yelled. Zeitoun said nothing. "Why the fuck are you eyeballing me?" the photographer yelled. He went on about how difficult he could make Zeitoun stay at hunt, but that a man with an attitude like that would not last long. Zeitoun had no idea what he had done to provoke the man. He was still cursing at Zeitoun, was led out of the room and returned to his cell. In the late afternoon, Zeitoun again heard footsteps coming down the hallway. He went to the front of the cell, and there he saw the same guard. "What are you two doing in here?" "In there," the guard asked. "What are you saying?" Zeitoun hissed. He had never been so angry. "You can't do that kind of thing in your cell, buddy," the guard said. "I thought that was against your religion anyway." That was it for Zeitoun. He let loose a barrage of expletives and threats to the guard. He didn't care what happened. The guard seemed shocked. "You really talking to me that way? You know what I can do to you?" Zeitoun was finished. He went to the back of the cell and folded his arms. If he were any closer, he would be too tempted to throw himself against the bars, grabbing for any part of the guard's flesh.